panel on the name Continuity or Change, Sovereignty, Hybridity, and Reconstruction. And we're going to start with the presentation of Marius Kalu, Kosovo under EU state building, discussing state weakness, democracy, and the ethnic character of domestic sovereignty. There's a change in title from the program. Please.
Thank you. Is it working?
I think it is.
Just hold them a little bit closer because we lower down the feedback.
Okay. Is that better? Okay. Yeah, so the title is a bit changed, but anyway, what I'm mainly looking at is the concept of state weakness, and I try to analyze that in the context of Europeanization of Kosovo, and by mainly comparing ideas about exogenous and endogenous factors on state weakness. My paper briefly examines the problems of contemporary state building and points out the contemporary model of democratic legal authority so as to understand why and what type of state building has been developed in Kosovo. I analyze this and I analyze the notions of state weakness and state failure in contrast to the proposed tasks and responsibilities that should make a state functional. By examining the impact of interventionism, which is the exogenous cause, versus the impact of a dual legacy of communism and conflict as the endogenous cause, this paper highlights the gap between local and international notions of conceptions of authority. The legitimacy of prioritized democratization in post-conflict societies has generally been considered to be undermined by the influence and control of external administration. However, legitimacy is also indicated by the capacity and also the will of the political authority to provide essential public goods. Overall, I suggest that different understandings of authority encourage external administrators to provide external legitimacy, what is also known as suprastate authority, while local population are seeking for sub-state local actors, local legitimacy that can substitute the duties of state authority. If we identify external imposition or control as the key problem of contemporary state building missions, therefore the external source of legitimacy, then the solution to encourage local autonomy for self-governing capacity should give positive results. This could be done by developing domestic legitimization. However, in practice, this may not work, given that the problem of post-conflict societies to develop a democratic legal authority has more significant and complex origins. By this I mean local context, legacy of the conflict, and society-state gap. Furthermore, liberal democratic measures and standards that define contemporary state building are implemented improperly, not necessarily because they are imposed, but because they are in conflict with the internal pre-established fracture between state and its population, and the gaps in the understanding of authority. Altogether, the conceptual of the modern state formation process highlights three main functions and responsibilities of the state as a provider of security, representation, and welfare. In this way, a very simple way of identifying state weakness or failure is in relation to the state's capacity and will to perform these main functions of governance. The conceptions of what a state is and how a state should work can be put together to analyze the rationale behind contemporary efforts for state building, materialized by the model of democratic legal authority. This model is based on the belief by the people in a geographically defined polity in the legality of democratically enacted rules, and to quote Ponzio, the right of democratic authorities to issue commands under such rules. If this is the objective of post-conflict state building missions, then the understanding of authority is essential for the functionality of state building processes. The gap in conception of authority between international officials and local population could represent the key challenge for all contemporary attempts to implement democratic legal authority in post-conflict societies. This is nevertheless related to the concern over what is the character of the under construction domestic sovereignty. So one thing I introduced in my analysis is the idea of state and society developed by Migdal. emphasizes the importance of social control, notion of social control, and as a key variable for measuring the strength of the state. Therefore, the capacity of the state to control its own population and the means of doing so. States are today categorized as strong, weak, failing, or collapsed. The criteria for such classification is mainly derived from the state's ability or inability to deliver high qualities and quantities of essential political goods, the critical ingredients of good governance. Another source of debate, so this concept of essential public goods is another source of debate, but generally the key political goods can be identified with security, good governance, effective rule of law, freedom and rights, economy, infrastructure. My focus is, however, on domestic sovereignty when evaluating whether the state has the capacity to govern and is able to exercise its powers and use its resources for the benefit of its people. From the perspective of the EU and its exported model of governance through enlargement and state-building practices, the conditions to develop a functional and strong state are mainly political and economic. By political, EU means stable institutions, guarantee of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and minority issues, and by economic, functional market economy. In the analysis of state building and state weakness, the element where these two, the exogenous and endogenous theoretical perspective meet, is the legitimacy of the political authority under the impact of the state-society fracture. This intersection indicates that the role of non-state actors in keeping political authority, so it indicates the role of non-state actors in keeping political authority away from the state. Both forces originating outside the boundaries that the state claims for itself and those within its borders have contested state efforts to monopolize the exercising of authority. The result has been, as Migdal portrays it, the limited state. In the context of the liberal state-building framework, the problems of identifying collective will, implementing popular democracy, or developing domestic sovereignty are related to the causes behind the absence of a state-society interdependence. So, in the first part of the paper, I look at the exogenous explanation, and I focus on critique of liberal interventionism, and I look at how character of sovereignty has been changing, and I look at notions of legal domestic sovereignty, also popular sovereignty, and then I emphasize how the states has developed a dual responsibility, not only towards other states, but also towards their own population. In other words, critique of liberal interventionism is that it has created external source of legitimacy via interventionism, and therefore the consequence is that there's an undermined political authority of state actors, and legitimacy comes from the outside. Again, this state-society rift. My analysis of the local context and of the endogenous character of state weakness looks at the impact of the historical legacy of communism and conflict on the evolution of state building. The focus of state building missions is generally finding ways to consolidate societies emerging out of conflicts. However, there is a gradual decrease in attention given to the original issues that caused the conflicts, and as a consequence provoke state weakening or state failure. I try to show that even though there is a danger of state collapse, post-conflict societies such as Kosovo are installed with a perpetual state weakness that is fueled by the same social, political, economic, and cultural legacies. To call Migdal again, if we are to understand the inherent limitation of states, we must develop a focus on processes, one that starts with a web of relationships between them and their societies. A key aspect of state building in ex-colonial and ex-communist societies is that they have a heterogeneous character with cultural, ethnic, racial, religious, social, and political factions. In Kosovo, I argue that alternative sub-state forms of authority are an impediment to establishing a pluralistic society in post-conflict period, compounded by the post-communist culture of distrust of central government, breeding tradition of non-communication and non-cooperation with central government structures. if you analyze this post-conflict and post-communist context, another potential problem is that of developing ethnic sovereignty. It is essential to remember here that peace building includes the phases of stopping a conflict followed by the post-conflict efforts to maintain peace. However, in the aftermath of an ethnic conflict, there is a possibility of establishing a political context favorable for the victim side. In other words, one ethnicity can be overprotected and given the attribute of who is local in the eyes of international administrators. This has been very obvious in the legacy of Southeastern Europe and the ex-Soviet Union space. Not only so the focus is on ethnicity in pre- and post-war Kosovo as well. And if you look at what has been happening in Kosovo after 1990, for example, there's been a parallel state, and then there was the NATO intervention. You had the post-war context with the external administration of the UNMIK, which has also created a lot of space for ethnic politics and has created very limited space for democratic politics. In this context, there's been a high risk of actors ethnic actors getting involved and getting to simulate liberal democratic means of governance. My empirical work looks at multi-ethnicity and minority rights protection, and what I try to do is to investigate what's been happening since the Declaration of Independence in 2008, and how the Constitution has created a multi-ethnic state in Kosovo. And in other words, try to look at to compare the de jure and de facto accommodation of diversity. This was an imposed model of multi-ethnic democratic governance, which has positive intentions, but at the same time has unforeseen consequences. One of them is again this possibility of fostering social divisions, fostering a state-society gap by creating or recreating identities. One of the reasons, for example, to divide the Kosovo society into three pieces, which is the Albanians, the Serbs, and the other minorities, with an impact on both the state and the civil society level. Kosovo is therefore in a contest between state and sub-state actors in a competition over authority. At the same time, actors are legally de-ethnicized but politically ethnicized, and local actors are in position of simulating or substituting external liberal democratic directives, but in practice, looking at the local non-democratic interest. So another key question that rises up is that who is manipulating whom in this game, and actually it's very interesting to emphasize that domestic actors matter, and they're very important. There's different means, but there's the same result, maintaining state weakness. I'll conclude by saying that perpetuating the state-society division and the ethnic character of state building sustains state weakness. Thank you.
Previously, state building was based on ideas of modernization and industrialization. This can be best seen in W.W. Rostow's Stages of Economic Growth. This is the belief that a state should be able to become industrialized and support its own citizens. That has moved to a much more different scale, a much more micro scale, based on the individual and the self-reliance of the individual. The individual is built to cope with external forces rather than transform the external forces in the state. This more wholesale approach that's been taken by state building has as good, it seems that the individual in the country that's being built has got more rights and is being looked after better. But matter of fact, they seem to be held in the same position that they were before the conflict, before the international community has gone in. So there's been a general move away from giving states that are being built power to change their external environments and their internal environments, and more move for adaptation to the environments which exist. This, I believe, can best shown in the argument between government and governance. Government is supposed to be an autonomous way for states to act, to make decisions and progress, whereas governance is merely managing the situation which they're currently in. The move towards good governance is a shift in how the state and the market interact. The state is no longer a collective resistance to the market, i.e. the welfare state which we live in here in most developed countries. The state's role has been changed to allow for deeper penetration of market forces in those societies. There's two further weakenings of the states. First is the theoretical weakening of the states, which across the board of social theories, states have increasingly been cast as a problem rather than a solution. This can easily be shown with the interventions of the 90s and probably more recently the interventions in Libya and the ongoing conflicts in Syria. The second weakening of the state, which I argue, is that the citizens of the non-Western state has been cast as a global citizen rather than one that is tied to a domestic authority. And this can be shown by the rights that are attributed to them. They are international human rights, they are civil political rights, rather than domestic rights which we have. So the international community has chosen to favour civil political rights over economic rights in these countries. People don't have the right for a minimum wage, say workers, amount of time they work, and all sorts of rights. These are sort of Lockean conceivable rights. Thus, the non-Western citizen has a full arsenal of rights to protect himself against the state which he lives in, but he doesn't have the right to protect himself against the extremes of the market and general market forces that are global. The impact of these rights can be seen in Kosovo, which has a very low and flat tax rate, clearly favouring the individual business over the state's ability to raise funds to be able to build this infrastructure and then provide the citizen with a better economic outlook. Economic rights have been denied because interventions in the economy to provide a minimum redistribution in favour of the poor will lead to a violation of freedoms. There's these freedoms that are civil political freedoms that are so protected that it does not allow for any economic rights to be established. While civil political rights are the cornerstone of good government, they don't produce any economic prosperity or development. This can easily be seen in countries which have gone through the good governance policies, such as East Timor, which has 50% unemployment, Kosovo with 40 to 45% unemployment, and Bosnia, which has been going through the good governance agenda for nearly 20 years and still is in the same situation. So, when asked what type of capacity are we trying to transfer into these states? Are we trying to make them safe for the citizen, or are we trying to better the condition of our citizen? it's a question of control, whether we are enabling them to control their external environment. But the idea of control and the changing of the external environment has become a negative concept. And it's thought that as an actor we could never be able to see the unintended consequences of our actions. So the fewer unintended consequences there are, the more likely we are to act. Therefore, the non-Western state has been tasked with regulation, facilitation of the market, and has not been able to take on wholesale industrialization, as it is seen as too much of a risk. Got a quote from Sherman here, who says, "At the end of the 20th century, and still nowadays, it is precisely of unintended consequences of the technological process which has and still has much of a paralysing effect on imagining positive future scenarios." I argue that allowing non-Western governments to generally control the government rather than just through governance, we must overcome these unintended consequences and give them the power to change their environment. As Duffield argues, the international community's response to poverty is to securitise poverty rather than to resolve poverty through development. So all we're doing is just making the best of a bad situation rather than imagining a better situation. Therefore, the state that is emerging is not the industrialising and modernising state that emerged in the struggle against colonialism and sought to reduce the economic gap between West and the rest, to the state which facilitates the self-reliance of the individual and the facilitation of the market. The citizens of the non-Western world are conceived as people in constant crisis, which need very basic support mechanisms for survival and prevention of conflict, rather than industrious people who need a little bit of extra help to be able to create their own societies. Under good governance, it's obviously clear that the aim is not to create states that are classically understood as self-governing, independent and autonomous political subjects. The goal has, through good governance, been redefined as good management of external conditions. What must be noted here is that the external conditions of developed states and undeveloped states is very different. Developed states see the external condition as one which is relatively equal with other competitors. And is able to sell secondary and tertiary goods and exchange those for higher outcomes, higher return. However, developed states are reduced to selling their primary sources and for very low returns. So competition, we can say that competition is good, but if your state is undeveloped, competition reduces your return and produces a worse outcome. State building does not try and establish a state that is able to receive higher returns from global competitions. Instead, it is a state that is very capable of efficiently privatising and legislating for privatisation of resources. But that's what we mean by a successful economy when we build states now. How good are they privatising their resources? Not how good are they at making their citizens wealthy. State building consisting of governments does not allow the construction of economic and political safety nets for their citizens. The success of newly developed states has been achieved in a way that is almost the antithesis of good governance. States that have achieved success, such as the East Asian tigers, China, Botswana, Japan, have concentrated power, have relative autonomy. The initial stages, there was very close tie between the government and the production in that country. Lee Tan argues that the late mover advantage that these states have, the states that are undeveloped now, means that they need different structures, much more radical structures to enable them to catch up. with where we are now. So, in conclusion, the question I must be asking, what are we trying to achieve through state building? Is it a stable, contained state that has whose citizens are protected from harm? Or are we trying to create a state which is autonomous, industrious, and most importantly, rich? I would argue that the first state building is carried out under the first due to risk averseness, because we can't accept the unintended consequences of our actions. In constructing state building in a risk-averse manner, we have not been willing or able to hand over genuine power to native administrations to allow them not only to transform their environment, but also eventually to transform ours. Thank you.
So yeah, this is part of my PhD research that I'm conducting now. And I'm looking in my research at the failure of state building in Palestine over the last 20 years. And more specifically, I'm looking at the latest version of the state building venture, which I call Fayyadism. And Fayyadism is just to make a reference to the West Bank Prime Minister, Salam Fayyad. So they created the ism for him, just to give him the credit. So that is the notion when I say Fayyadism throughout the presentation is the state building, governance, and development paradigm in the West Bank over the last, since 2007 onwards. And what I will be arguing that the old-fashioned state-building venture that was conducted there, which was based on neoliberal economic agenda and Bavarian notion of and style of monopoly of violence, actually what it did, it entrenched the occupation rather than make the state just around the corner as claimed. So in essence, the Fayyadism paradigm is an anti-hybridity paradigm. I don't want to equate between anti-hybridity and moving toward the social, but it is, because I still need to think more about it, but I think it is going against, in a way, against our theme of this conference. Maybe I'm thinking now, if I want to present again, maybe I will choose the model of Hamas in Gaza, because there will be much more state-building notion into our theme. So the neoliberal economic agenda, Bavarian notion, Bavarian monopoly of violence were the two pillars for any Palestinian state, regardless of the existence of the occupation and the internal divide. So I will be looking at West Bank. I will be looking beyond Arafat era, or what is here Fayyad. But before digging more into details or the dimension of this Fayyadism paradigm, I would like to go back a little bit to the facts on the ground. And I'm going back to these because I believe that they are relevant in a way, and that they are really dismissed. If you can see the Palestinian loss of land between 1946 until 2010, these days you can see these fragmented islands. These are the green things. This is what is called the West Bank. So the whole story that majority of you saw in the United Nations in September, talking about the whole West Bank and Gaza state, it's not really about what is in the 1967 borders or so. It's about these fragmented islands. And the whole venture of state building, the $21 billion invested in the Palestinian economy over the last 19 years, this is what has been created. So I refer to these because I think it's really important to see how this level of fragmentation and this territorial fragmentation has emerged. If we just look at the West Bank to see why this happened, I'm just providing here a quick example, actually, where you can see the occupation practices, how it created this fragmentation between checkpoints, to road gates, to blocks, and you can see how they are spread over the West Bank, trenches, road barriers, and etc. They are really quite long, and it will be more problematic if you add the settlements for them, and if you're thinking of the Oslo Accords framework where the West Bank was divided into Area A and B and C, and you can see how the West Bank is divided. What I'm trying to say here is studying the West Bank as the mainstream discourse and international institutions trying to say that it is a post-conflict situation is quite problematic. And studying the Palestinian conflict and post-conflict is just like it is basically in conflict, and any advice based on that can be really problematic. Thinking of that, then the whole notion of sovereignty, control, come to the picture, where basically the Palestinian Authority there does not have any of these basic sovereignties or control or authorities that we can talk about. Palestinian Authority that can function and build a state there. So. This is just to give the how much aid the Palestinians received to this state-building venture and to development. But actually, the facts on the ground are quite problematic. Employment remain high, poverty remain high. Like the socioeconomic picture does not give any good picture. But against all of that odds, where we see territorial fragmentation, political divide, the Prime Minister Fayyad say that we get closer to the rendezvous with the freedom. West Bank is already a state in all but name. So you can see, I'm just highlighting here the divide, whereas like between facts on the ground and what is the discourse of state building that we're seeing there. Someone can see a state on just around the corner, but the facts on the ground tell us completely different. You can look at the achievement of Fayyadism through different reports. I'm definitely not looking at them, or even through the indicators of the West Bank, and you can see all of the beauty over the last 4 or 5 years of the indicators. Everything is jumping up as Palestinians are ready. But if I look more into the Fayyadism paradigm, it's based on four main pillars, which again is monopoly of violence and rule of law, and create an accountable Palestinian Authority institutions, bring effective public service delivery, and market-oriented economic growth. However, if we dig a little bit more behind that, we can see that monopoly of violence here create this notion of anti-hybridity, where only one form of resistance, which is exclusive, peaceful, popular resistance, is allowed. So here we can see the how the shift happened into suppressing all the indigenous, all the built-in or locally sensitive mechanisms into creating this sort of police and police state, even though the authority itself does not have an authority. So there is a tension there. Another tension is that what is hiding there is that the authority tried to build local legitimacy through achievements, or what they claim that we build a state. But on the other hand, it lacks any sort of checks and balances, check and balances institution. The parliament is intentionally, I would say, absence, and that is hitting the democratic norms. But also the most risky and dangerous part of this is going back to the notion of where the conference is the shift toward understanding sovereignty or functionality for sovereignty. And I think this notion of functionality for sovereignty in the Palestinian context can be quite problematic, because it means instead of challenging the occupation, it means adapting with the occupation and sustaining it. And here's the risk where you start to have this notion of functionality as replacement for sovereignty, or functionality as, instead of going back to the what the authority need to have, then you try to depoliticize the Palestinian cause and create and bring this normal notion of reforms. And of course, it's not like there's a whole package of economic agenda that go hand with the economic peace, but also this neoliberal economic agenda go there. But the irony is that you don't have the real basis for neoliberal agenda to implement them there. So after a couple of years, this notion, this paradigm of building a state, or the Fayadism for governance and state building, proved some fragilities, I would say. There was celebrated economic growth over the years as a readiness for the Palestinian state. However, if you look just behind the 8 or 9% economic growth, you can't see it's anything but economic growth. It is unsustainable, it is jobless, it is aid-driven, has nothing to do with Gaza or Jerusalem, it is anti-poor. You see absence of democracy and check and balances institution. You see the fundamental pillars, as I said, they are not there. Dependent on the Israeli mercy and on the donors' money. So, and unreliable private sector if you want to go for this sort of the market lead. However, what I would say as a major argument here is that what happened with this notion instead of Fayadism, instead of building a state, actually, it was entrenching the occupation and making the status quo sustainable. And here, the Palestinians are no near to self-determination or sovereignty. And we need to think, when we take the case of Palestine, about the peculiarity of it, where it's a sort of a framework where there's a governance but without a state. And I'm not sure how we can manage these in the 2-3 minutes remaining. But if we look at the security at the security sector, what happened in the security sector, and if we compare them between what happened under Arafat and what happened under Fayyad, I would say that Arafat in a way was a pro-hybridity and Fayyad was an anti-hybridity. If we look at the security, Arafat used hybridity as a tool to maneuver and the card in negotiations and tool for resistance coming out of this revolutionary legacy. But Fayyad, and on the other hand, coming with this technocrat approach, coming with this ready blueprint format for reform and state building, wanted to make this armament process happening, and which create this monopoly of violence to create the nation state later on, and then later on went to the UN, and it's more pragmatic approach rather than Arafat. However, regardless of all of these changes that happened over the landscape of the security sphere, at the end of the day, on the ground, it remained to protect the Palestinian, but also the Israeli security mechanisms and matrix of control, but never to challenge it. And it was on the expense of other developmental gaps. So to conclude in a call to go beyond Fayyadism, so to address its fragility. If it is a state building program that is based on neoliberal agenda, then you need to have the preconditions for that before having them, before implementing them. And if you believe that, you need to question the notion of development and state building under occupation. Is it possible to talk about state building, development under occupation, or do you really need to go back to the old strategy that was under Arafat, liberation before state, but here under Fayyad it was state before liberation? And the whole notion of legitimacy of the authority is once again on stake, because what's happening on this paradigm is that the Palestinian Authority tried to seek international legitimacy first before local legitimacy, and the bridge was coming from the international arenas to the local ones. And here also it's another problem, not to mention again the check and balances, absence of check and balances institutions. And the last part is how to rethink neutrality and to remember colonialism, and this is specifically addressed to the international donor community, where just try to make the whole notion of normalizing the Palestinian situation as there is no external factor, or as there is no occupation or just as any other case of post-conflict situation. And here where I think the whole notion of neutrality need to be readdressed and revisited in this context. But at the end of the day, I think what the title of your paper is quite relevant to what I think, at least not to talk about the arguments, because the good governance approach in the Palestinian case over the last couple of years was exactly used to bring stability and was exactly used for that purpose. But what the Palestinians at the end of the day need, they need to practice with the support of the international community, they need to practice self-determination in order to bring prosperity rather than stability. I think I will stop here.
It's actually done mostly by the United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti, MINUSTA, and this is mostly the mission the paper focuses on, although state building has a longer presence in the country. The United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti was established on the 1st of June 2004 by the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1542. The mission succeeded a multinational interim force authorized by the Security Council in February 2004 after then-President Jean-Bertrand Aristide departed Haiti for exile in the aftermath of an armed conflict that spread to several cities across the country. Aristide was overthrown in the past in 1992, I think, I don't remember, early 90s anyway. So it's a conflict that goes back in time. After the conflict, it also suffered a devastating earthquake on 12 January 2002, which resulted in more than 220,000 deaths, also including 96 of the UN peacekeepers, and delivered a severe blow to the country's already shaky economy and infrastructure. So the Security Council, with the Resolution 1908, it decided to extend the mission's mandate and endorsed Secretary General's recommendations to increase the overall force levels of MINUSTA in order to support the immediate recovery, reconstruction and stability efforts in the country. The paper emphasizes this shift that took place in the mission's mandate, its scope and its scopes throughout the years. Methodologically, it's discourse analysis on the UN Security Council resolutions. The theoretical framework is Barry Busan's, Olive Weaver and Jaap de Wildt's securitization process and the new security agenda, as described in the book Security, a New Framework of Analysis. The analysis tries to investigate how state building gradually changed from a strictly political operation established to deal with a conflict situation to a more complex operation that also responded to economic, societal, human and environmental issues, especially after the disastrous earthquake that took place in 2010. I argue that there is a shift in the discourse of the UN Security Council through its resolutions, from the traditional political military security agenda to include non-traditional security issues, mostly economic, societal, and in the economic, societal, and environmental sector. What was described by previous discussant as the social, that goes beyond political. As I said before, United Nations involvement in Haiti started back in 1990, when the United Nations Observer Group for the verification of the elections in Haiti observed the preparation and holding of elections in the country. Following the 1991 coup and the overthrow of the legitimate president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the situation worsened. So a joint United Nations and Organization of American States international civilian mission was deployed in the country in February 1993. A number of successive United Nations state-building missions followed the multinational force from 1994 to 2000. That included the United Nations mission in Haiti, the United Nations support mission in Haiti, the United Nations transition mission in Haiti, and the United Nations civilian police mission in Haiti. Serious reforms never took place, although there were some positive developments. So in early February 2004, armed conflict broke again in the country, in the city of Conifes, and fighting spread to other cities within the following days. Gradually, the insurgents took control of much of the northern part of the country, and the Security Council adopted Resolution 1529 in order to authorize a multinational interim force on the 29th of February 2004. Because they determined that the situation in Haiti constituted a threat to international peace and security. Later on 30 April 2004, after recommendations of the Secretary General, the Security Council decided to adopt the Resolution 1542, which established MINUSTA, that took over from the multinational interim force on the 1st of June 2004. MINUSTA was originally set up in order to support and to assist the transitional government in its efforts to ensure a secure and stable environment. But the earthquake came as a tragic setback in 2010. And resulted, as I said, in many deaths, and delivered a severe blow to the country's economy and infrastructure, impeded nation-building efforts in the country, and led to a climate of general political uncertainty. So the MINUSTA, within hours of the earthquake, provided immediate relief operations, assisted by a number of the UN member states, and specialized military and civilian units that took search and rescue operations, established field hospitals, and provided immediate support to life-saving assistance efforts and restoring key infrastructure. MINUSTA made extraordinary efforts to restore its capacity and acted decisively in order to respond to post-earthquake needs within its mandate and in line with the priorities of relief, security, and restoration of state capacity. Now, the resolutions. If we analyze the language that used in the resolutions by the Security Council, we can trace that shift with regard to what is being securitized by the United Nations, by the Security Council, what is perceived as a threat to the country's stability and to the regional peace and security.